Then I developed severe PTSD from Rex Halston, and I understood. I genuinely become a sobbing, quivering wreck if I look at Rex Halston for too long, or worse, an Elvis. I am not exaggerating at all. It began when I was invited to a Halloween party with a very specific costume gimmick. That gimmick was Elvis. Entrance was $5, or if you came dressed as Elvis, you got in for free. I did not have an Elvis costume, so I paid the entrance fee. About half of the partygoers skipped the Elvis nonsense as well. That still left 30 or 40 poorly conceived Elvises who had not left the building. I am not great with extremely tight crowds, and the party was far busier than it should have been. It was held in someone's house, and I do not think they realized how much attention the Elvis gimmick would draw. There were men doing their best to be the king. There were goofy Elvises dancing in their blue suede shoes. There were sexy Elvises, both female and male. I even saw one girl using the anonymity of her Elvis mask to repeatedly flash her breasts. I was glad that I had shown up in sensible jeans and a strappy top. I had gotten a ride with a friend who does not drink, so I helped myself to a beer from the keg. I needed it to deal with the atmosphere. I also forgot to mention that, as part of the Elvis theme, a certain singer was playing constantly on the stereo. There was absolutely no break from Elvis's greatest hits playing on repeat through Spotify. Even after my first drink, I deeply regretted being there. But my friend had wanted to come. She really loved Elvis. When I went to get my second drink, a short female Elvis stumbled up to me and handed me a red plastic cup of beer. She mumbled something about suspicious minds and staggered off. Normally, I would never accept a drink from a stranger, but even with the Elvis costume, I recognized her as a friend from college. What I did not realize at the time was that she was not saying suspicious minds. She was trying to tell me that the drink was suspicious and asking if I could get rid of it for her. After everything that happened at the party, I asked her why she handled it that way, and she could barely even remember. She said she was drunk and scared because there was an Elvis who would not leave her alone, and she was worried that her drink had been spiked. Of course, being the buzzed idiot I was and overwhelmed by so much Elvis, I just downed that drink. I do not think it was roofied or anything. I had been roofied before, sadly, and it did not feel like that. But there was something in that drink, something that almost immediately started giving me a headache and cold sweats. I began looking around for my friend, trying to tell her that I needed to leave and that I really did not feel well. And that was when I saw him, the most realistic-looking Elvis at the party. He was not wearing a mask. His hair was styled in a pompadour, and he wore Elvis sunglasses and that white rhinestone suit that made the king so famous. And there was only one man I knew who could look that much like Elvis without actually being Elvis. And remember when I said I had been roofied before? Well, I had been roofied by my ex-boyfriend a year earlier, and he had that same baby face, the same dark hair, the same build, everything. This was him. The Elvis staring at me across the room was my ex-boyfriend, Ethan Crowley. I had taken out a restraining order against him. I was never able to prove that he was the one who roofied me, but he became what they called a fixated individual after I broke up with him. A complete and total nut job. And now, here he was, dressed as Elvis, watching me from across the room. I knew he was watching me because he did that thing where he pointed 2 fingers at his eyes and then at me, as if to say he was watching. I darted into the other room, looking for my friend. Where the hell was she? I squeezed through the crowd, shoving lesser Elvises aside as I went. People started yelling at me, telling me to watch it, but I could feel the white suit man's eyes on me. And sure enough, when I looked around, there he was, slowly walking through the crowd like a slasher from an old horror movie or something, but as a perfect depiction of Elvis. I ducked into another room. What was this house, I thought? Why were there so many rooms and so many people dressed as Elvis? I could not really tell in that moment, but I knew I had to get out of there. The Elvis was still pursuing me. I tried to tell myself it was just the drugs and alcohol, but he kept following me, slow and steady. I think I must have been looping around the house, barely coherent, because he always seemed to be there. Eventually, I found myself outside in the front yard. More Elvises milled around, and music played from some kind of outdoor system. I turned back toward the front door, and the white suit man was standing there. There was no mistaking it. It was my ex-boyfriend, Ethan Crowley. He had that knowing, smug grin on his face that was so familiar to me. The terror of him catching me was unspeakable. And then, despite pursuing me slowly for most of the night, he suddenly leaped down the porch steps and came running straight at me. His sunglasses stayed on his face. His Elvis sideburns obscured his features somewhat, and I was certain it was him, though. Why else would he be charging at me? I was confused, but I screamed. I turned to run, and my legs just gave out beneath me. This evil Ethan Crowley Elvis was on top of me, grabbing at me, grabbing my hair and my clothes, and I have no idea what he had planned. It felt like he was trying to strip me naked right there on the front lawn, in front of numerous other people. Ethan Crowley had always been a complete psychopath, especially when he was on coke or some other drug, which was often. Thankfully, the crowd didn't take kindly to an Elvis trying to violate me out front. The biggest, fattest Elvis I'd ever seen came thundering across the lawn. I later realized he was wearing a fat suit as part of his costume, the whole shtick being Elvis just before he died. At the time, though, the hamburger sticking out of his jacket pockets made me feel like I was going mad. I didn't care. Fat Elvis leaped the final distance toward the white suit man, my boyfriend, my ex-boyfriend, and body slammed him so hard that the two of them went flying across the lawn. I pulled myself to my feet, puking as I did so, which, in retrospect, I think saved me from whatever dodgy drug had been slipped into my drink earlier that night. Fat Elvis did his best to stomp on the white suit man, but his bulk, or rather the fat suit, kept getting in the way. But now, others were joining in. A group of random impersonators began absolutely pounding on the white suit man. That was when my ex-boyfriend rolled free and pulled out a gun. Within seconds, he fired, hitting Fat Elvis square in the stomach. Fat Elvis reeled back and fell over, and the other Elvises raised their hands in surrender, backing away from the white suit man. As he stepped back, he fired one more shot into the air, causing everyone to duck, and then he took off into the darkness around the side of the house. A couple of the Elvises wanted to follow him, but the rest of us told them not to. The guy was armed. Then I told them I knew who he was and that we could just call the cops. After all the chaos, skip forward a few hours. I found my friend, who took me to the Ridgeway Police Department, and I explained everything. I told them my attacker was my ex-boyfriend, Ethan Crowley, and explained the history. They ended up looking him up, and the officer gave me a strange, heavy look. Ethan Crowley had been arrested the day before for an armed robbery at a convenience store in a completely different state, she explained. She went on to say that he was still in custody and had been for at least 24 hours. I kept insisting. I was certain that the white suit man was Ethan Crowley, and she even placed a call to the Jefferson County Sheriff where he was being held. There was no doubt he was still incarcerated. There was no humanly possible way that the white suit man was Ethan Crowley. Later, they questioned him about the incidents, and he appeared completely clueless. They told me he even seemed to show genuine concern for me. And that was that. A couple of years ago, I was stalked and attacked by an evil Halston impersonator who vanished into the night. I have absolutely no idea who he was or why he targeted me. He looked so much like Ethan Crowley that I could have sworn it was him, but it could not have been. Now, anytime I see someone dressed like the king, even Elvis himself, I think back to that Halloween party and remember what he tried to do to me and what almost happened. One piece of good news was that plus-size Elvis, as I mentioned, was wearing what turned out to be an extremely large and cumbersome fat suit. He was actually a skinny guy, and that meant the bullet from Elvis's handgun was blocked by all the foam in the costume. So plus-size Elvis, who turned out to be a friend of mine from college, under all that makeup and padding, was completely fine. I have no idea what became of the white suit man. I've searched the news for reports of an Halston impersonator committing violent crimes, but I've never found anything like that. All I can hope is that he was picked up for some other offense, and that the only Elvis impersonation he's doing these days is the jailhouse rock. When I was in college, a friend of a friend threw a small Halloween house party. Nothing too wild, just the usual decorations, costumes, punch, apple bobbing, and vodka. The usual. When we arrived, the center of the living room couch was occupied by the Gray Wolf. I had never seen the Gray Wolf mask like it before. It looked like something straight out of a movie, and you would have sworn it was a professional prop. His snout looked wet. His maw glistened with saliva. The Gray Wolf hair looked disturbingly real. And his eyes? I still don't know how he could see through the mask, but they were fully realistic eyeballs. It was incredible. The guy just sat there in the middle of the couch. If it hadn't been for the fact that he was only wearing a mask as part of the costume, I might have assumed he was a prop. Below the mask, he wore a Hawaiian shirt and a pair of chinos. He had thin, knobby legs, dirty sneakers, and on his arms he had tattoos that looked suspiciously like prison tattoos. I figured they were just drawn on, like he was dressed as the Gray Wolf character I didn't know about. So I assumed I just couldn't identify the specific one he was supposed to be. Occasionally, one or two of us would sit next to him and try to talk to him. But the guy stayed in character the entire night. At first, he only let out this wheezing kind of growl. After a while, he just stared straight ahead in silence while the party went on, and the Gray Wolf continued to sit there. We started to speculate about who he might be, and eventually it clicked. He was our friend Caleb Morris, and this was exactly his style. The previous Halloween, he'd come dressed as a mannequin and stood in the corner for an hour before finally moving and scaring the hell out of us. So if it was Caleb Morris, we decided to leave him alone and see what he would do. Surely he had a big scare planned for us. Caleb Morris did have a big scare planned for us. Just before midnight, he burst through the front door dressed as a chainsaw killer costume, swinging a toy chainsaw. He apologized for being late and said his car wouldn't start. Our eyes snapped back and forth between Caleb Morris and the Gray Wolf. The Gray Wolf just sat there, staring at us without moving, and it started to seriously unsettle everyone. We explained the situation to Caleb Morris, how the Gray Wolf had been sitting there silently the whole time, and he got visibly freaked out. He walked over to the guy and said, "Buddy, say something. Buddy, who are you?" There was no reply. Caleb Morris grabbed the Gray Wolf mask and pulled it off. I will never forget what we saw underneath. His face was gray. Yellow bile had leaked from the corner of his mouth. His sightless eyes stared at nothing. Panic exploded as the party scattered and someone called the police. Thankfully, none of us were suspected of anything, because the autopsy showed he had died from a massive drug overdose. Apparently, he had wandered into our party, sat down, and quietly died on my friend's couch. He was just an unknown male in his 40s, and none of us knew who he was. The police couldn't even confirm his identity. In the end, We were the only people at his small, state-funded funeral. For reasons we'll never understand, this unknown male had loaded himself with a cocktail of drugs, put on the most realistic "the Grey Wolf" mask I've ever seen, and come to our party to die. The least we could do was give him some kind of send-off. I still do not know his real name or why he chose our party to end his life, but I still think about him sometimes, and I hope he is in a better place. I hope he is finally at peace. In the late 1970s, two drifters crossed paths and discovered a shared darkness that should never have met. Together, they roamed California's quiet roads, searching for victims who would never be seen again. What they carried with them were ordinary tools, chains and tape, but what they did with them became the stuff of nightmares. Most of us were Daniel Walshes, living in Australia, and we were an odd bunch. There was me, Pastor Daniel Wright, and Marcus Hale, all from New Zealand, and we had moved over together. Then we met Liam O'Connor, an American guy who just clicked with us and became the missing member of our quartet. We were lads who loved to party and loved a lot of things, and we did not take life too seriously. We were not haters then, and we are not now. I hate boats. I never had a fear of open water before, but I do now. That fear started one Halloween when my idiot buddy Liam O'Connor decided that we should all pool our money, rent a yacht, pick up some girls at a coastal bar, and pretend we were rich Wall Street idiots heading out to sea for a good time. It sounded like a flawless idea at the time, but it was not. Liam O'Connor barely knew how to pilot a boat. We drifted out to sea for a while, dropped anchor, and figured we had alcohol and some other substances to keep the night going. We managed to convince 3 girls to come party with us, ignoring the fact that there were 5 of us guys on board. Only 4 of us were the tight crew. The other guy was an Australian we had met at the bar, the one with the substances, who practically begged us to let him join our fake rich hedge fund party. He said he had some great investment opportunities to run past us. Of course, we were not hedge fund managers or Wall Street types or anything like that. We were more like the schlubs from The Hangover or any Vince Vaughn or Owen Wilson American comedy you could name. Just regular guys who liked to party, who liked to try and usually fail at hooking up with some honeys, and who just wanted to have fun. We had also blown most of our savings on renting this yacht for one day. The deposit alone was completely eye-watering, and we would lose it if any damage happened to the vessel. Because of that, the 4 of us were all a bit jumpy about getting too drunk or wrecked, especially when the Australian guy, who we decided to call Gavin Rowe, started pulling out the baggies. We realized that Halloween fell on a full moon that year in 2001. Gavin Rowe got incredibly excited about this, doing nose candy and howling at the moon as soon as the sun went down. Please remember that we were dumb guys in our early 20s. Gavin Rowe was probably 35, and we did not know him at all. We had invited him onto a boat from which there was no real escape. The guy was completely off his head on the powder. Me and my 2 other buddies, Pastor Daniel Wright and Marcus Hale, were making half-hearted attempts to hit on the honeys we picked up, but they were far more interested in Gavin Rowe and his wild antics. Liam O'Connor, on the other hand, was absolutely freaking out, worrying about the deposit we had dropped on the yacht and stressing about everything in general. Eventually, he pulled me aside while the others were getting drunk and high with the strange Australian Gavin Rowe. Liam O'Connor told me that he had messed up badly and that a serious storm was heading straight toward our location. I said that was fine and that we would just raise anchor and sail back to the docks. I told him we could not be that far out. That was when Liam O'Connor admitted that he had never actually dropped anchor at all, and that the boat had been drifting slowly farther and farther out to sea, and that he had no real idea what he was doing. It felt like nature, or God, or someone else was playing a joke on us. No sooner had Liam O'Connor made this confession than the sky completely opened up and heavy, freezing rain started pounding down on the boat. The girls ran under the cover of the bridge, but there was barely enough room for all of us to squeeze into the small interior spaces of this tiny yacht, the best we could afford. Gavin Rowe, on the other hand, stayed standing out in the storm. Lightning was striking the water dangerously close, and the choppy waves had started rocking us back and forth. Liam O'Connor, Marcus Hale, and Pastor Daniel Wright were yelling at each other about how to get back to shore, and the girls were screaming. Now, I'm not convinced they even knew how to plot the route back. How Liam O'Connor managed to convince the rental company to let us take the boat out is something I'll never understand. But he was always good at bullshitting his way through situations. But back to Gavin Rowe. He was hollering and screaming about some sea witch, and I think he called her Shazanzi or something like that. Even 24 years later, I've never been able to find any evidence of this so-called sea goddess. Gavin Rowe was imploring her to save us. Then he paused, as if listening for a reply. That was when one of the girls told me they'd seen Gavin Rowe take a whole bunch of LSD, at least 3 tabs. Great. So now we had this mysterious Australian drug addict standing out in the storm, and I had no idea what he was doing next. He pulled a knife out of the boat's toolkit and started carving a sigil into the wooden decking. Of course, Liam O'Connor's first thought was the deposit and how much money we were about to lose. He ran out into the storm and started screaming at Gavin Rowe. Gavin Rowe tilted his head to one side again and yelled that he'd do whatever Shazan said. Then his face went completely serious. Rain was hammering down, lightning was striking, and he told us that because it was Halloween and a full moon, Shazan demanded 2 sacrifices to release us from her domain. I calmly asked him what he meant by that, and he held up the knife and made a very clear slicing motion across his neck. I told him, "Hey, buddy, don't hurt yourself." He laughed and said it wasn't him that Shazan wanted as a sacrifice. So I asked him who she wanted. He pointed to one of the girls we'd brought with us, and then to Liam O'Connor, the only guy who knew how to pilot the damn boat. There was no way I was going to let this high-as-hell Australian lunatic sacrifice any of us to his imaginary sea witch. But the storm was closing in, and Liam O'Connor was doing his best to navigate the choppy water before any real danger hit us. At least, any real danger beyond the drugged-out men demanding that Liam O'Connor and the girl, whose name I don't even remember anymore, though I think it was probably something like Belinda, come forward and fall on his blade in the name of Shazan. I looked around in the pouring rain, trying to find a way to de-escalate the situation without getting stabbed in the face by this madman. I spotted a harpoon gun on the floor, but no, I couldn't do that. I wasn't about to shoot this guy with a spear and carry that on my conscience. He was drunk and tripping on LSD, and he didn't deserve to die. He'd seemed like a solid bloke before all the sea witch sacrifice nonsense. Unfortunately, Gavin Rowe saw me eyeing the spear gun and decided to make his move, charging toward me with the knife. He said I wasn't the sacrifice Shazan wanted, but he wouldn't let me get in the way of saving the world from the storm that would consume us all. According to him, that was what was happening. This was the apocalypse, and it was on all of us. And only the deaths of those 2 random people he had just met would save the world. That is, he was completely off his face on drugs. And when people are that far gone on drugs, they like to talk at length. And Gavin Rowe talked. So much, in fact, that he didn't notice one of the girls sneaking around the side of the boat toward him. I remember her name was Elise Warren, because we dated for a while after this. It didn't really last, and I guess being held captive by a sea god worshipping nutjob isn't the best foundation for a long-term relationship. Anyway, Elise Warren crept up behind Gavin Rowe while he was waving the knife in my direction. She grabbed a kind of pole, something used to fish items out of the sea if they fell overboard. Gavin Rowe was in the middle of another rant about saving the world. Rain was hammering down. Lightning lit up the sky. Then, Elise Warren brought the pole down on his head as hard as she could. He staggered, and for a moment I wasn't convinced he was going to fall. I rushed in, like the hero I always wanted to be, and landed the best and only punch I've ever thrown, straight into his jaw. The knife flew out of his hand and went overboard, and Gavin Rowe collapsed forward. The others ran over, except for Liam O'Connor, who was still fighting the wheel and trying to steer us away from the storm. Lead found some rope and a few other things, and we tied the lunatic Aussie up at the back of the boat. Somehow, thankfully, Liam O'Connor managed to guide us back into the quay. We expected the cops or the Coast Guard or someone to be waiting when we returned, but it turned out to be a bit of an anticlimax. Liam O'Connor had never thought to radio the Coast Guard for help, something we still give him grief for to this day. There was only one person waiting on the dock, and I could tell immediately she was the Margaret Rowe type, middle-aged, soaked to the skin, and looking like she was ready to call the manager. Thankfully, her anger wasn't directed at us. It was directed at Gavin Rowe. She said she was Gavin Rowe's wife, took one look at him hog-tied and unconscious in the back of the boat, and muttered something like, "Bloody Nora, not again, you bloody C-word." Before we could protest, she climbed aboard, slapped Gavin Rowe awake 6 ways from Sunday, then marched him to a nearby car and shoved him into the back seat. That was when I noticed she was driving a Bentley, and a very nice one at that. She thought she was about to do a runner, and one of my buddies was already writing down their registration plate. But then Margaret Rowe came back and was surprisingly apologetic. Her excuse was simple. Gavin Rowe was having some kind of midlife crisis and liked to party. We tried to explain that he had been threatening to sacrifice a couple of us to some sea witch, and Margaret Rowe just shrugged and said, "Yeah, he gets a bit weird on Halloween and on a full moon." So she supposedly was not surprised. I remember thinking that this guy really did not sound safe in modern society. But he was not our problem anymore, at least not after Margaret Rowe pulled out her checkbook and wrote us a very sizable check to cover the damage Gavin Rowe had done to our boat and any other trauma we had actually suffered. We are talking a 5-figure amount, more than enough to buy our silence, as much as I am ashamed to admit it. We made sure to plead with Margaret Rowe to get her husband some help. She implied that it was an uphill struggle, but that they were trying. Then she said maybe we could join them on their boat sometime, because Gavin Rowe was not normally like this. I hoped that was true. She gave me her card. While we never took her up on the offer, with no desire to ever see those people again, I did look them up a few years later and realized we had been in the presence of a couple of very rich people. In our attempt to impress some hot chicks by pretending we were wealthy enough to own a boat, we learned the reality of having the kind of money that turns you into someone like Gavin Rowe. After that, I spent the next 20-odd years feeling perfectly content being a lowly mechanic in a small Australian town. The guys drifted apart. Sometimes we still message on Facebook and talk about the night we were almost sacrificed to an imaginary sea witch during a storm on Halloween. We rarely tell other people the story, because it sounds so completely insane that we usually cannot be bothered trying to convince anyone it is true. Maybe it will stand as a cautionary tale for anyone who decides to rent a boat and sail into a storm during a full moon on Halloween night. I grew up in a fairly fundamentalist Christian town. I know what people usually assume. Communities like that tend to get a bad reputation. All I can share is my own experience, and I was raised with strong morals, a strict but fair set of rules, and an understanding and love of the teachings of Pastor Daniel Wright that I genuinely believe can make the world better if followed properly. I am not here to argue theology, but to set the scene that I lived in a very traditionally church-centered town. I still live there now, and I am proud to raise my kids there. That is all I will say. Now, I'm not here to convert anyone else. Free will means you can believe whatever you want. That's the beauty of it. But it's important to this story that you understand that from a very young age, I had a strong, willing faith in Pastor Daniel Wright, one that I and everyone around me openly celebrated. At the same time, we also went completely all out for Halloween. Our town, back in the 1980s, genuinely won awards for our parades and decorations. You see, we didn't believe you should shy away from Satan or the demonic. You were supposed to confront it, parody it, even make fun of it. That's what Halloween was all about for a lot of Christians. And while it has roots in pagan culture, I honestly believe the way some Christians adopted it was something legitimately beautiful. All of this is to say that the annual children's Halloween party held in the church hall was a huge deal for us local kids. We got to dress up as spooky skeletons, ghosts, witches, and beasts, though we did draw the line at devils and demons. I'm not sure if that was ever a written rule or just an unspoken understanding that we didn't want to portray ourselves as directly satanic. The lore, such as it was, said that the townsfolk decorated everything to look scary, and if any real evil ever came to town, it would see all of that and know it wasn't welcome. We knew it was metaphorical and a little silly, and mostly an excuse to let loose, but it was also a genuinely nice lesson our town elders came up with. Halloween fell on a Saturday that year. I was dressed as a vampire. My buddy Brian Collins decided he had to go as the Ultimate Warrior from WWF, as it was called back then, which earned a few chuckles. Hannah Reed came as a witch, but the good kind. Luke Tanner was a classic skeleton. You get the idea. The party, which was held in the church hall, had sandwiches, little cakes, party rings, jelly, ice cream, and everything a proper kids' party should have. The hall was decorated with paper bats and pumpkins, and there was even a pumpkin carving contest that the mayor of the town, who I'll call Mr. Watkins, was going to judge later that afternoon. The event was mostly for the kids, but plenty of adults attended as well. It was a real community gathering. I remember Derek Rogers, who owned the local bar at the time and whose son still owns it today, hauling a sound system down to the church hall and acting as a sort of DJ. He played classic Halloween songs like the Monster Mash and whatever other Halloween tracks existed back then. I don't remember much about the music because Derek Rogers didn't get very far into his set before the event happened. Now, we were all dancing and singing and having fun in the middle of the church hall when suddenly, out of the blue, there was a huge crash, an explosion of stone and wood. People started screaming and running away from the direction of the sound. Me, I was just standing there, frozen like some kind of fool. A gosh darn truck, complete with wicked-looking metal roll bars on the front, had just crashed straight through the side of the church hall. I recognized the truck. It belonged to the handyman I'd seen around town recently. He was a newcomer, and we always noticed newcomers. I'd heard my mom and pops talk about how he spent almost all his spare hours, when he wasn't doing odd jobs for cash, praying in the church. Nobody really knew where he lived, and they said maybe he just lived in his truck. He yelled at me one time when I was walking past his truck, parked on the sidewalk while I was painting Widow Young's front porch, and he told me to get away from his goddamn property. He said he knew what us young spawn of the devil were like. He used language that I don't think any God-fearing man should ever use, especially toward a kid. Still, I figured God must love him, because he had a cross tattooed over his heart that you could see when he was working. Now, though, he was leaping out of the truck, stumbling over the debris, and pointing at us kids. In one of his hands, he held a rusty tire iron. I can't remember exactly what he said, word for word, but it was something like he called us spawns of Satan and little demons. He said he knew we were infesting the town with our evil, that we were goblins, that he could see through the masks we wore, and that we were all going to die. Of course, that made most of the kids start screaming and crying, running back to their parents at the far end of the room. Everyone was still a little shell-shocked from the truck smashing through the church wall. Most of the kids were younger than me and my friends. We were 8 and 9, and most of them were 5 or 6 years old. In that moment, my protector instincts kicked in. I spat out the little vampire fangs I was wearing, which were annoying as heck anyway, and I yelled back at the handyman. I said we weren't evil, sir, and that we loved Jesus just like he did. I might have been a little delirious given the situation. Then he said something I didn't expect. He said our town was infested with evil because we allowed certain people to live there. I can't repeat what he said exactly, but he used racial slurs that made it clear he believed non-white people shouldn't be allowed to live in our town. Then this absolute weirdo ripped his shirt off, and I saw he had other tattoos. They were sort of cross-shaped, but not really. I think you can probably imagine the design I'm talking about. So there I was, an 8-year-old kid facing down a racist who represented everything that I and Pastor Daniel Wright himself stood against. My small hands curled into fists, and the handyman stared at me, completely fixated, as he took one step toward me, then another. I heard the sound of a gun being cocked, then another, then another. 7 adults had finally arrived at the scene. White, black, Latino, a multicultural mix of the beloved members of our community, our loved ones. The very people this hateful man who had risked killing a group of kids had decided were evil. One of them was my own dad. He placed a hand on my shoulder and gently guided me behind him, whispering that I had done good. 7 guns were trained on the man. I prayed to God, harder than I ever had in my life, that he would not be foolish enough to charge them and start a firefight. I said the prayer first under my breath, then louder and louder. I asked Jesus to forgive this man. My mom ran up from behind and tried to pull me away in case things turned violent, but I kept praying. The handyman raised his tire iron, looking like he was about to rush them. Then a gun went off. It was my dad's gun. He had never been a good shot, and Frank Doyle had always teased him for it. To this day, I do not know whether my dad's aim was true or off the mark. He claims he hit exactly where he meant to. The bullet struck the handyman in the hand holding the tire iron. He dropped the weapon immediately and began howling in pain. My dad stood there, frozen, while the other gun-toting townsfolk rushed in, kicked the handyman's legs out from under him, and held him at gunpoint until the sheriff's backup finally arrived. The handyman was arrested, charged, and sent to a prison upstate. I do not know exactly what charges were brought against him, and I do not want to know. I only know that I attended a Halloween party where a deranged, misguided soul nearly drove his truck into us. In my view, we avoided any loss of life or serious trauma, thanks to the love of Jesus, the bravery of the townsfolk, my refusal to back down, and, most importantly, my dad's absolutely terrible aim. This happened nearly 40 years ago, and the old man is still around. He still cannot hit a barn door with a banjo. I would not have it any other way. I did not plan to celebrate Halloween this year. I bought some candy on the slim chance that kids in my apartment block might go trick-or-treating, but it had never happened before, so I did not expect it to happen this year. Not only that, I was working late at the office, and by the time I began the walk home, it was past 10 at night. Normally, I would grab a taxi or, these days, an Uber, but it was Halloween and the streets were pretty busy. It felt safe enough to walk the few blocks home, or so I thought, and there were crowds milling about in costume in the streets, near where my office used to be. So I blended in with them for a while, making my way toward the next block. I expected the festivities to continue there, but they didn't. It was as if the street had been completely abandoned. Wherever the crowds were heading, it wasn't this direction. That was fine by me. I hurried down the darkened commercial street, my heels clacking against the pavement, the sound echoing off the empty buildings. Then I heard footsteps behind me. They were slow, deliberate, and perfectly matched to my own pace. Anyone who has ever walked home alone at night knows that sound. It is the sound of being followed. I sped up, not daring to look over my shoulder. A large man was walking behind me, and there was no doubt he was following me. When I stopped, he stopped. When I moved faster, he matched my pace. I reached the end of the block and paused, searching for a direction to turn, and that was when I saw him pointing at me. He appeared to be wearing black gloves. I could barely make out his face, but the gesture itself was unmistakable. The way he pointed said everything. I am coming for you. I am going to get you. That was when I remembered the crowd on the previous block. I tried to picture which way they had been heading, and I thought I could cut through to them if I turned right. Without hesitating, I kicked off my heels so I could run more easily in my stocking feet and sprinted toward the next street. The farther I went, the more I could hear music and the sound of people partying. Behind me, though, I could still hear those heavy footsteps thundering closer. The stalker was still following. Thankfully, I was fit, fast, and worked out regularly. He was a big man, and I was confident I could outrun him, and I was right. I burst out into a dense crowd of demonic figures at Red Lantern District. I had completely forgotten that my city's first ever Halloween parade was happening that year. We had never done anything like it before. It was a massive street party with floats, performers, and all kinds of spectacle. It was the perfect place to disappear and lose whoever had been chasing me. I pushed through the crowd, not caring if I was disrupting anyone. Nobody seemed to notice because they were all partying, dancing in circles around the parade float, rolling slowly down the street. On it, skeletons danced while corpses burst out of coffins. The creepiest song I think I'd ever heard in my life was blasting from the speakers. And then the worms crawl in, the worms crawl out. Something, something, and you'll be the first to die were the lyrics. For the first time, I genuinely wondered if I'd fallen asleep at my desk and was dreaming I was trapped inside a horror movie. Then someone slammed into me, sending pain through my shoulder, and I knew this was real. Worse than that, the man who'd been following me was now creeping along the side of the hearse float. I started running again, pushing toward the end of the parade, and crashed straight into a group of college-age guys, spilling one of their beers all over them. I rushed to apologize and explained that I was being stalked by a man who was going to hurt me, believing they would help. Instead, they started tugging at me, demanding I pay for their drink. One of them tried to grab my purse, and another, clearly drunk out of his mind, pulled me toward him and asked for a kiss. I had run from one danger straight into another. These young men clawed at me, grabbed at me, and all I could do was scream for help and swing my purse at them. I struck one of them on the side of the head, and he shouted in pain. By then, the parade float had reached us, and the music was deafening. The worms crawl in, the worms crawl out. I remember that clearly. From the top of the float itself, a broad, muscular skeleton started shouting. He was screaming at the guys, demanding to know what they thought they were doing. He jumped off the moving float and came toward us. He was a big guy, and so were the other skeleton figures who followed him. They'd been performers on the float, but the moment they saw those drunk frat bros assaulting me, they leaped in to defend me. The boys scattered into the crowd, yelling and making vague, drunken threats as they disappeared. I thanked the skeletons, and they pointed out the direction the parade was heading and the quickest route back to my part of the city. It was only a few blocks away, and I had simply gotten turned around and lost in the chaos. The Halloween decorations and party equipment made the area look almost alien. And so I made my way home, and I was almost at my apartment block, just a building or two away, when something caused me to stop and turn. The stalker. I had completely forgotten all about him, but he was standing there at the end of the street, a hood covering his face, one black glove held out, pointing at me. Our eyes were meeting, or at least I think they did, and I could barely see his face beneath the shadow of that hood. And then he began to run, charging straight at me. I turned around and fled as fast as I could to my apartment door, swiping the security key and diving inside, slamming the electric door behind me. The security officer, Officer Miles, looked up at me in surprise, and I blurted out what had just happened. And together we watched and waited for that stalker to appear in front of the door, as at the same time the security officer, Officer Miles, called the cops. The stalker never showed up though. For whatever reason, he stopped following me just before he reached the building. We called the cops, and they checked what little CCTV footage there was along the route home. But with all that Halloween parade chaos and the dark costume the stalker was wearing, the best they got was a blurry shot of me running down the street, pursued by some dark shape. And to this day, I have no idea who that stalker was. I have never seen him again, and this was almost 6 years ago now. And every single day, I expect to see him following me. I never walk home alone anymore, and I never attend Halloween parades either. Both events on the same night make me a little nervous, and Halloween can be genuinely terrifying, and not always in the ways you expect. So I was at a Halloween party back in 2001, and it was the craziest night of my life. I will never forget it, even though I kind of wish I could. I did not really know anyone there, apart from the girl who had brought me, because we were kind of hooking up at the time. She was a bit rough around the edges, and so were her friends. And when we got there, there was one girl just passed out on the front lawn, her skirt hitched up, her underwear visible, sleeping out there with no shame. But what the hell, right? I had seen worse at frat parties. Now, little did I realize that this sleeping beauty would become the beast of my Halloween. And an hour or so had passed at that point, when we were all inside, dancing and having fun and enjoying life. And then suddenly, the sleeping psycho came crashing into the house, screaming that she had just had a prophetic dream that the punch had been spiked with strychnine, of all things. And then her eyes locked onto me. She pointed and started screaming. I was the one. I was the stranger among them. She claimed I had spiked the punch and was trying to enact some kind of apocalypse prophecy. I was just sitting there thinking, no? But for some insane reason, half the party started to turn on me with a sense of suspicion. Someone yelled that the punch tasted a little strange. Another person shouted that they had seen me pour something into the bowl. None of that actually happened. I was not a cult leader. I was just there to have a good time, but half the party was not having it. The other half decided to come to my defense. The whole thing was insane. It was just Veronica Mills, who was always making up conspiracies and did have serious mental problems. A big fight broke out over me, and I was ducking, dodging, and diving to get away from this group of absolute idiots. The entire time, Veronica Mills was screaming that I was the Antichrist and had put strychnine in the punch. At the time, I did not even know what strychnine was. A group of guys seemed to believe her because they started grabbing me, holding me down, and punching me. At that point, I thought this was it. I was probably dead. I thought these drunk idiots were going to kill me. I tried to fight back, but it was 5 versus 1. Then another group of guys attacked them, and that gave me a chance to break free. I ran as fast as I could, jumped into my car, and got out of there. I did not care about the girl who invited me. They were her psycho friends. As soon as I was far enough away, I called the cops. Later, I heard the party got shut down, and there was no trace of strychnine or any other poison in the punch. I never spoke to any of them again, and I never wanted to. It was the most pointless and terrifying night of my life. Ever since then, I have avoided Halloween parties, or really any parties at all, especially the punch. So I have a weird Halloween story for you. My buddies and I were on the way to a haunted house attraction that also doubled as a Halloween party. It was what you might call a bespoke setup, put together by a friend of ours. I had just turned 21, and I was used to relying on other people to supply the alcohol at various keggers and gatherings. As we drove to the host's house in the hills, it hit me that I was finally old enough to legally buy alcohol and bring some beers to the party, and I would not feel like a scab who was always begging others for drinks. This was the first time I had stopped at a convenience store to buy alcohol. I was already buzzed. I had my ID with me, and I could legally buy whatever I wanted, and nobody could stop me. Vodka, rum, and gin. That was what I chose. I told my 2 pals to wait in the car, and they were both 20. I had a vague memory that some places will not serve you if you are with minors. I did not want to risk anything getting in the way of this rite of passage. So I walked across the parking lot, head in the clouds, and pushed open the door of the convenience store with the confidence of a 21-year-old who no longer has to rely on a fake ID just to fail at buying beer. The guy at the cash register was a scrawny man who looked only a little older than me. He gave me a strange, suspicious look that I read as, "You are underage, aren't you?" I shot him a wide, confident smile. Fair enough, I thought. I do have a bit of a baby face. I grabbed a basket to fill with my legitimately earned gains. I decided to take my time browsing the snacks, maybe grabbing Funyuns or Takis or something else for my buddies and me. Beef jerky sounded good, so that went into the basket. Candy corn was always a Halloween staple too. I looked over my shoulder at the cashier, and he seemed to be sweating heavily. He was not looking at me. He was staring at the mirror in the corner that reflected the entire store. I followed his gaze. My heart sank instantly. Crouched down 1 aisle away from me was a man wearing a balaclava and clutching what looked like a shotgun. I immediately understood what had happened. He had been in the middle of robbing the store when we pulled into the lot, and I had just wandered straight into the middle of a stick-up. Instead of turning me into bloody paste, the man had clearly chosen to hide behind the shelves, his shotgun aimed at the clerk as a warning. The clerk asked if I had found everything I needed, clearly trying to get me to pay and leave so he could call for help. I played along and told him yes, I was done. It was a clear tremor in my voice, and inside my head, it sounded like I was completely losing it. I glanced up at the mirror again and saw the gunman starting to stand. I thought he had noticed me. I saw his black masked head rise above the aisle, and he had, in fact, noticed me. He told me to move to the front of the store. His voice was muffled through the woolen mask, and I obeyed, doing my best not to lose control of myself. I have no idea why, but I kept hold of my basket of groceries the entire time. The gunman stepped forward and gestured for me to stand behind the store clerk, putting us both within range of a potential shotgun blast. This was it. I felt like I was going to die. I said a quick prayer and hoped my buddies in the car had somehow noticed what was happening from the vehicle and called the cops on their cell phones. All I had to do was stall for time. I remember asking the gunman what had brought him here today, and it was the first thing I could think to say. It was a dumb question, and he knew it. I could tell he was frustrated as he replied, telling me that he was here to rob the place, obviously. I figured I might try to appeal to his human side. I said that I was just there for the spirits. I mentioned going to a haunted house. I told him I thought I would pick up some spirits for the festivities. The guy was wearing a black mask, but I swear I saw him go pale. His eyes widened, and I had no idea what I had said or done to affect him so much. Then he said that this place had spirits. I was baffled. Of course it did. It was a wine, spirits, and liquor store. The gunman's eyes darted around, and the shotgun shook in his hands. That was when I had the dumbest revelation of my life. He thought I meant actual ghosts. He thought I was there to recruit dead spirits to come with me to a haunted house. Then he told me that they spoke to him too, that he heard their voices calling to him because he did. He said the spirits told him to come there that day and rob the place. At that point, I just winged it. I told him that was what they were like there. I said they were trickster spirits. I said they were trying to corrupt him so the devil could claim his soul. I told him it was my job to guide them to a nearby haunted house where they could be at peace. I was rambling, making up whatever I could because, from the way his hands were shaking, it looked like he was buying it. I told him he should not give in and should not listen to the voices. He told me he usually takes medication to keep the voices quiet, but he had not been able to afford it for a while, and his dealer was out of town. Great. This guy was likely suffering from heroin withdrawals, hearing ghostly voices, and holding a shaking sawed-off shotgun pointed directly at us. Suddenly, I heard distant sirens getting closer very fast. I did not look out. I just kept praying that the cops would de-escalate the situation before he could fire a shot. What happened next, I cannot explain. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened. A bottle of vodka fell off the shelf. It simply slipped and smashed onto the ground behind the gunman. The rational part of me knows he must have brushed it when he ducked down back there. Or maybe it was just poorly stacked. But late at night, when I have flashbacks to that hostage situation, I cannot help imagining a spectral figure giving the bottle a small nudge. I know that did not happen, but it felt like a miracle nonetheless. At that moment, the gunman whirled around at the sound of the glass breaking. When he saw it was a bottle of spirits, he let out a scream that I swear could have woken the dead. And then, this is the part I wish I could forget. I heard a gunshot, and the gunman's head exploded. He put the sawed-off into his own mouth and pulled the trigger. I heard the bell over the door ring, heard the cops rush in, shouting for me to get down on the ground, and I complied in a kind of daze. My ears were ringing from the shotgun blasts, and there was blood and all kinds of debris all over me. To this day, when I look in the mirror, I am convinced I have not washed all of it off. Later, we discovered the gunman had a history of severe mental illness and drug use. He had been in and out of facilities his entire life, never received anything close to proper mental health care, and turned to heroin to drown out the voices. When that ran dry, the voices came back. All it took was for me to mention spirits and for an ill-placed bottle to end his tragic life. We never went to that haunted house party, and I have never celebrated Halloween since. I think I am haunted enough as it is.